What happens when a cowboy orders a simple, honest bride? But the woman who steps off that train is a liar wrapped in silk and secrets? In 1881 Montana, Reed Callahan waited for the modest schoolteacher he'd been writing to for months. Instead, a stunning aristocrat named Seraphine descended from that dusty train, terrified, overdressed, and about to confess the truth that would shatter everything. He had one choice: send her back. But fate had other plans. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The August sun beat down on the Montana Territory Depot like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, turning the wooden platform into a griddle that shimmered with heat. Reed Callahan stood at the edge of that platform, his worn hat pulled low against the glare, his calloused hands gripping a bouquet of prairie wildflowers that suddenly felt foolish in his grasp. Around him, the small crowd of townspeople shifted and murmured, some meeting family, others collecting freight, but Reed's attention remained fixed on the approaching locomotive, its black smoke trailing across the endless blue sky like a promise finally kept. For 6 months, he'd been corresponding with Miss Eleanor Hartley, a modest schoolteacher from Philadelphia who'd written to him in response to his carefully worded advertisement in the matrimonial news. Her letters had been everything he'd hoped for: practical, kind, intelligent without being proud, faithful without being preachy. She'd written about her love of teaching, her skill with numbers and household management, her desire for a simpler life away from the crowded eastern cities. She'd sent a small photograph showing a pleasant-faced woman with dark hair pulled back sensibly, wearing a simple cotton dress with a white collar. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would wilt under the harsh Montana sun or crumble under the endless work of frontier ranch life. Reed was 42 years old, and he'd built his ranch from nothing but grit, determination, and more lonely nights than he cared to count. The Broken Creek Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving land God had ever created. He ran 200 head of cattle, employed 4 ranch hands, and had a solid timber house with glass windows and a real wood floor. Not a soddy or a drafty cabin, but a proper home. What he didn't have was someone to share it with. What he didn't have was the sound of a woman's laughter echoing through those empty rooms, or the warmth of companionship when the Montana winters pressed down like a frozen fist, or the hope of children to carry on what he'd built. So he'd done what hundreds of other Western men had done. He'd advertised for a wife. The train's whistle screamed as it approached the station, and Reed's heart kicked against his ribs like a Mustang testing a new corral. He straightened his shoulders, brushed dust from his best jacket, still worn but clean and mended, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Around him, the crowd pressed forward, anticipation crackling through the hot air. The locomotive hissed and groaned to a stop, its massive wheels settling with a final clank of metal on metal. Steam billowed across the platform, obscuring everything for a moment in white mist that smelled of coal and distance and possibility. Reed's fingers tightened on the wildflowers. Then the mist cleared, and his entire world tilted on its axis. The woman who stepped down from the passenger car wasn't Eleanor Hartley. She couldn't be. Everything about her screamed wrong in a way that made Reed's stomach drop like a stone down a well. She was breathtaking. That was the first thought that crashed through his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. She moved with the grace of someone who'd never scrubbed a floor or hauled water or worked until her hands bled. Her traveling dress, and Reed knew enough about women's fashion from the catalog his mother used to page through to recognize quality when he saw it, was made of deep emerald silk that caught the sunlight and shimmered like creek water over stones. The fabric was fitted precisely to her figure, nipped at a waist so small Reed could probably span it with his hands, then flaring into skirts that whispered expensively with every movement. Cream-colored lace adorned the high collar and cuffs, intricate and delicate. She wore gloves, actual kid leather gloves, not the practical cotton kind, and a hat that probably cost more than Reed paid his ranch hands in a month, festooned with ribbons and what looked like real ostrich feathers. But it was her face that stopped Reed's breath entirely. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with features so fine they looked like they'd been carved by an artist who specialized in angels. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips that were full and naturally pink, and eyes. Lord have mercy, eyes the color of honey in sunlight, wide and framed by dark lashes that needed no artifice. Her hair, what he could see of it beneath that ridiculous hat, was the rich auburn of autumn leaves, with rebellious curls escaping to frame her face. She looked like she'd stepped out of a painting in some fancy Eastern museum. She looked like she belonged at a society ball or an opera house or anywhere. But on a dusty Montana depot platform surrounded by ranch hands and freight wagons and the honest, hard-working people of a frontier town. And she looked absolutely terrified. Reed saw it in the way her gloved hands clutched a small beaded reticule, knuckles white beneath the leather. He saw it in the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted across the crowd like a cornered animal seeking escape. A porter followed her down the steps carrying two enormous leather trunks that looked like they'd survived European grand tours, and even he seemed uncomfortable with how out of place this woman appeared. The crowd had gone quiet, the usual greetings and reunions forgotten as everyone stared at the vision in emerald silk standing on their humble platform. Reed heard Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, whisper sharply to her companion, "Who on earth?" And someone else muttered something about lost and wrong station. But the woman's eyes were scanning the crowd with desperate purpose now, and when they landed on Reed, on the only man standing alone holding wildflowers like a damn fool, something shifted in her expression. Recognition. And something else. Resignation, maybe. Or determination born of desperation. She moved toward him. Each step was measured, elegant, despite the fear Reed could now see clearly in every line of her body. She crossed the platform while the entire town watched, and Reed found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at this impossible, beautiful, completely wrong woman approaching him. She stopped 3 feet away. Up close, he could see that her skin was like porcelain, unmarred by sun or wind or any kind of honest labor. He could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that made his head swim. He could see the fine trembling of her lips as she drew in a breath. "Mr. Callahan?" Her voice was molasses over whiskey, smooth, cultured, with the refined accent of the Deep South, maybe Louisiana or Georgia. Nothing like the plain Philadelphia speech he'd expected. "Mr. Reed Callahan of the Broken Creek Ranch?" Reed's throat was dust dry. The wildflowers felt ridiculous in his hands now, like bringing a child's toy to a royal court. He managed a single word. "Yes." Something flickered across her face, relief and guilt tangled together in an expression so complex Reed couldn't fully decipher it. She extended one gloved hand, the gesture formal and entirely inappropriate for what was supposed to be a bride meeting her future husband for the first time. "I'm Seraphine Locke," she said, and Reed heard his entire future crumbling in those 4 words. Not Eleanor, not the woman he'd been writing to, not the simple practical teacher who'd promised to help him build a life. I believe you were expecting me." The platform was so quiet Reed could hear the snap of a flag in the hot breeze 3 buildings away. He looked at this Seraphine Locke, this vision in silk and secrets, and knew with absolute certainty that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. "I was expecting Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice rough as a gravel road. "The school teacher from Philadelphia." Color flooded Seraphine's cheeks, the first genuine, unpolished thing about her. Her eyes dropped to the weathered planks of the platform. "Yes," she whispered. "About that, none." Reed didn't take her to the ranch. That was his first decision, made in the 2 seconds it took for the full weight of the situation to crash down on him. Whatever was happening here, and he had a sick feeling he knew exactly what was happening, it couldn't be resolved in front of the entire town of Silver Falls, standing on the depot platform, gawking like they'd never seen scandal before. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and harder than he intended. "Somewhere private." Seraphine nodded, relief and shame warring across her features. Reed gestured to the porter who'd been standing uncertainly with the expensive trunks. "The hotel," Reed instructed. "Hold those at the hotel registry." "Yes, sir." The porter looked grateful for clear direction and hurried off. Reed turned back to the woman who'd just upended his carefully planned life. "There's a private dining room at the Silver Creek Hotel. We can talk there." "Of course." Her voice was barely audible. He didn't offer his arm, though every ingrained manner his mother had beaten into him demanded it. Instead, he turned and walked, hearing the rustle of her expensive skirts as she followed. Behind them, the crowd erupted into whispered speculation that would be all over town within the hour. The walk to the hotel took 5 minutes. 5 minutes during which Reed's mind churned through possibilities, each worse than the last. She'd lied about who she was. That much was obvious. But why? What could possibly drive a woman who looked like walking money to pose as a simple schoolteacher and travel to the middle of Montana territory to marry a rancher she'd never met? The Silver Creek Hotel was the finest establishment in town, which meant it had wallpaper that wasn't peeling too badly and furniture that didn't wobble if you sat carefully. The proprietor, Tom Watson, took one look at Reed's face and wisely asked no questions, just showed them to the small private dining room normally reserved for business meetings and discreet negotiations. "Coffee," Reed said. "Strong. And close the door." "Yes, sir." Tom disappeared, and the door clicked shut, leaving Reed alone with Seraphine Locke in a room that suddenly felt far too small. She stood in the center of the space, her hand still clutching that small beaded bag, her posture perfect despite the fear radiating from her like heat from a stove. Reed tossed the wildflowers on the table. They looked even more pathetic now, already wilting, and removed his hat, running a hand through hair he knew was too long and probably had chaff in it from this morning's work in the barn. "Sit," he said, not ungently, gesturing to one of the chairs. Seraphine sat, her movements controlled and graceful even now. Reed took the chair across from her, the table a necessary barrier between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Reed studied her, really looking now without the shock of first sight clouding his vision. She was even more beautiful up close, which somehow made everything worse. But beneath the beauty, he could see signs his initial surprise had masked. There were faint shadows under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept well in days. Her hands, even gloved, shook slightly. And there, at her wrist where the glove didn't quite meet the lace cuff, he caught a glimpse of a bruise, yellowish-green with age but unmistakable. "Start talking," Reed said, "and I want the truth. All of it." Seraphine drew in a shaking breath. When she looked up, her honey-colored eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "My name is Seraphine Locke. That part, at least, is true. I'm from New Orleans originally, though I've been living in Atlanta for the past 5 years. I'm 26 years old, and She paused, swallowing hard. "I am not Eleanor Hartley." "I gathered that," Reed said dryly. "Keep going. Eleanor was my companion, my lady's maid." The words tumbled out now, faster. "She helped me for years, and when I had to leave Atlanta, she was the one who suggested this arrangement. She'd seen your advertisement in a newspaper that had made its way to us. You thought you could lie your way into marriage, and I'd be too polite or too stupid to send you back," Reed finished, his voice flat. "No." Seraphine's head snapped up. "No, it wasn't like that. Or it was, but not for the reasons you think." She pulled off her gloves with sharp, agitated movements, and Reed saw her hands were shaking badly now. "Eleanor is the one who wrote to you, every letter. She has beautiful penmanship and a way with words I've never possessed. She sent her photograph because I couldn't risk anyone recognizing me. The plan was that I would study what she wrote, learn to be the woman you expected, and by the time I arrived, I would be Eleanor Hartley in every way that mattered." Tom knocked and entered with coffee, the interruption giving Reed a moment to process this admission. He poured 2 cups while Seraphine sat rigid and trembling. Then Tom retreated once more. "Why?" Reed asked, pushing 1 cup toward her. "You clearly come from money. That dress alone probably costs more than most people in this town make in a year. Why would someone like you need to con a rancher into marriage?" Seraphine's laugh was bitter and broken. "Someone like me," she repeated. "You think you know what that means, but you don't." She lifted the coffee cup with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it despite the August heat. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a man named Charles Whitmore III. He was from one of the finest families in Atlanta, and it was considered a brilliant match. I was so naive, so foolish. I thought he loved me. She fell silent, staring into the dark liquid. Reed waited, something in his chest tightening at the pain in her voice. "He didn't love me," she continued softly. He loved my family's money. When my father's business collapsed, when we lost everything, Charles ended our engagement immediately. No explanation, no apology, just gone. And then the debts came. Massive debts. My father had borrowed heavily, invested in ventures that failed. When he died, his heart couldn't take the stress. Those debts passed to me as his only heir. Reed's coffee sat untouched. What kind of debts? $30,000. The number fell between them like a stone. Give or take a few hundred. The bank seized everything. The house, the furnishings, my mother's jewelry, everything. Everything except what I could hide or carry. These clothes, a few pieces of jewelry I've been selling off piece by piece just to eat. And the debtors, they didn't care that I'm a woman alone. They wanted their money, and when they couldn't get it. She touched her wrist unconsciously, where Reed had seen that bruise. Understanding crashed through him like cold water. They hurt you. One of them got aggressive when I couldn't pay. My landlady intervened, but she told me I had to leave, that they'd be back and next time it would be worse. That's when Eleanor, dear, loyal Eleanor, who'd stayed with me even when I couldn't pay her, suggested this solution. Seraphine finally met his eyes. She said Western men needed practical wives, not society ornaments. She said if I could learn to be useful, to be the kind of woman you needed, maybe I could have a fresh start. Maybe I could be safe. The room fell quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Reed absorbed this story, watching Seraphine's face for any sign of deception, but all he saw was exhaustion and fear, and a desperate hope that was already dying as she watched his expression. "So you lied," he said finally. "Yes." No defense, no excuse, just that simple admission. "You pretended to be someone you're not." "Yes." "You let me believe I was entering into an honest arrangement with an honest woman." "Yes." Her voice broke on the word. "And I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. But I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know where else to go. Everyone I knew turned their backs when the money disappeared. Everyone except Eleanor, and she sacrificed her chance at her own future to give me the letters, the plan, the hope that maybe I could become someone worth wanting." Reed stood abruptly, his chair scraping harsh against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, staring out at Silver Falls. His town, his territory, his life that this beautiful liar had just crashed into like a meteor. "Do you know anything about ranching?" he asked, his back still to her. "No." "Can you cook, clean, sew, do laundry, tend a garden, preserve food, care for livestock?" Each question was met with the same quiet answer. "No." "Can you shoot, ride, handle being snowed in for weeks at a time with nothing but howling wind and your own thoughts for company?" "No." He turned to face her. "Then what exactly did you think was going to happen when you got here? Did you think I wouldn't notice that you can't do a single thing a ranch wife needs to do? Did you think those pretty dresses and that cultured accent would make up for the fact that you'd be useless?" Seraphine flinched as if he'd slapped her, but she didn't look away. "I thought I could learn. Eleanor taught me what she could, basic cooking, mending, household management. I studied. I practiced. I'm not completely helpless." "You're wearing a silk dress that would catch on every branch and fence post within 5 miles of my ranch," Reed said, his voice hard. "You've got hands that have never seen real work. You smell like expensive perfume instead of honest sweat. Everything about you screams that you don't belong here, and we both know it." Tears spilled down her cheeks now, but she held his gaze. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere anymore. But I'm a fast learner, Mr. Callahan. I'm stronger than I look, and I'm desperate enough to do whatever it takes to earn my keep, to prove I can be the wife you need." "The wife I need," Reed repeated, the words tasting like ash, "is someone who can be a true partner, someone who can work beside me, not someone I have to take care of like another piece of delicate furniture. The wife I need is someone honest, someone I can trust. You're not that woman, Miss Locke. You never will be." The truth of his words hung in the air between them, brutal and inescapable. Seraphine's face crumpled, and she covered it with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she was clearly trying to contain. Reed felt something twist in his chest, unwelcome sympathy for this woman who'd lied to him, who'd disrupted his plans, who represented everything he didn't need in his life. But she was also desperate and alone and clearly running from something dark enough to drive her across the country into the arms of a stranger. He moved back to the table, sitting heavily. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I'm not a cruel man, Miss Locke, and I'm not without sympathy for your situation, but I can't marry you. You have to see that." She lowered her hand slowly, her face blotchy and streaked with tears that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I understand," she whispered. What will you do?" Reed had been thinking about that since the moment she'd stepped off the train. "When's the next eastbound train?" 3 weeks, she said, her voice hollow. "The schedule is limited this time of year." 3 weeks. Reed pulled out his money pouch, counting out bills, more than he could really afford, but his mother hadn't raised him to abandon a woman in need, no matter how complicated the circumstances. He pushed the money across the table. "That's enough for your ticket back and for room and board until then. The hotel here is decent enough, and Mrs. Watson will make sure you're treated properly. I'll speak to Tom, make sure he knows you're under my protection until you leave." Seraphine stared at the money as if it were a coiled snake. "I can't take this." "You can and you will," Reed said firmly. "Consider it compensation for the time and money you spent getting here based on an arrangement that's now dissolved. I won't have it said that I left a woman stranded, regardless of the circumstances." That's far too generous." Her voice shook. "Especially given what I've done." "It's practical," Reed corrected. "And it's final. Take it, Miss Locke. Go back east. Find an honest position somewhere, maybe as a companion or a governess if you've had education. Use whatever skills you actually have, but do it somewhere else with someone else." She slowly reached for the money, her fingers trembling as they touched the bills. "Mr. Callahan..." "Reed, I truly am sorry. For what it's worth, Eleanor's letters weren't all lies. The things she wrote about wanting a simpler life, about finding purpose and building something real instead of just existing in society's cage, those feelings were mine. That desire was genuine, even if everything else wasn't." Reed stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Maybe so. But desire isn't enough out here, Miss Locke. Out here, you need skill and strength, and the kind of honest fortitude that can't be learned from books or faked with pretty words. I wish you well, I truly do, but I need to find that elsewhere." He walked to the door, his hand on the handle, when her voice stopped him. "What will you do? About finding a wife?" Reed paused, not turning around. "I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll place another advertisement. Be more careful about verification this time. Maybe I'll accept that some men are meant to build alone." He looked back over his shoulder, meeting those honey-colored eyes one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Locke. I hope you find a place where you can be safe and honest and whole. But that place isn't here, and I'm not the man who can give it to you." Then he opened the door and walked out, leaving Seraphine Locke sitting alone in that small dining room with a pile of money that felt like both salvation and damnation, watching the future she desperately grasped for slip away like water through her elegant, useless fingers. The sun was setting by the time Reed made it back to his ranch, painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and crimson that would have been beautiful if he'd been in any state to appreciate them. He'd stopped at the general store to let Mrs. Henderson know that the woman at the hotel was to be treated with courtesy, but that there would be no wedding. The news would be all over town by morning, he knew, but at least it would be accurate gossip rather than wild speculation. His ranch hands, Jake, Tommy, Old Bill, and the newest hire, a kid named Sam, were finishing up the evening chores when Reed rode in. They took one look at his face and wisely asked no questions, though he could feel their curiosity burning like brands. "Boss," Jake ventured carefully as Reed dismounted, "we, heard there was some excitement in town today." "It's handled," Reed said shortly, unsaddling his horse with more force than necessary. "Nothing to discuss." "Yes, sir." Jake retreated, and Reed heard him quietly redirecting the others to give the boss some space. Reed worked through the evening routine on autopilot, checking the cattle in the near pasture, examining the fence line that Tommy had reported needed repair, reviewing the books in his office even though the numbers swam before his eyes without registering. His house, which had seemed peacefully quiet just this morning, now felt oppressively empty. Every room echoed with his footsteps. Every corner held the ghost of the future he'd been planning. Eleanor in the kitchen, learning his mother's recipes. Eleanor in the parlor, maybe reading by lamplight while he worked on accounts. Eleanor in the... He cut that thought off sharply. That night, Reed sat on his porch, nursing a whiskey he didn't really want, staring out at land he'd fought for, built on, poured his soul into. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the prairie, and Reed felt the sound resonate in his chest like a physical thing. He'd done the right thing. He knew he'd done the right thing. Seraphine Locke was wrong for this life in every possible way. She would have withered here like a hothouse flower in a blizzard. Better to end it now, cleanly, than to watch her struggle and fail and grow to hate him and this place and the trap she'd walked into with lies and desperation. But unbidden, his mind conjured her face, not the polished society beauty who'd stepped off that train, but the broken, honest woman who'd sat across from him in that hotel room and admitted her sins. The fear in her eyes, the bruise on her wrist, the desperate hope that had died as he'd walked away. Damn, Reed muttered into his whiskey, then downed the rest in one burning swallow. He'd done the right thing. He had to believe that. Even if tonight, alone on his porch, under the vast Montana sky, the right thing felt an awful lot like the loneliest choice he'd ever made. Seraphine sat in her hotel room, a modest space that was still far nicer than the boarding house she'd fled in Atlanta, and stared at the money Reed Callahan had given her. $200 lay on the washstand, more cash than she'd seen in the 3 years since her father's death. It was mercy money, pity money, guilt money maybe, though she wasn't sure what Reed had to feel guilty about. She was the liar. She was the one who'd shown up in silk and secrets expecting, what? That he'd be too overwhelmed by her appearance to care about the deception? That love would somehow bloom instantly and override all practical concerns? Eleanor would have fit here. Eleanor, with her capable hands and practical nature, her cheerful resilience and genuine goodness. Eleanor would have stepped off that train, assessed the town and the man and the life with clear eyes, and made it work through sheer determination and honest effort. But Eleanor was back in Atlanta, having used the last of her savings to buy Seraphine's train ticket west, believing in a plan that had just collapsed spectacularly. A knock at the door made Seraphine start. She quickly wiped her eyes. She'd been crying on and off since Reed had left the dining room hours ago, and called out, "Yes? Mrs. Watson, dear, may I come in?" "Of course." The hotel proprietor's wife entered, a comfortable woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She carried a tray with soup, bread, and tea. "Thought you might not have eaten," she said simply, setting it on the small table by the window. "Thank you," Seraphine managed. "That's very kind." Mrs. Watson studied her for a long moment. "Tom told me what happened. Well, what he knows of it, which isn't much. But Reed Callahan's a good man, and if he ended your arrangement, he must have had good reason." Seraphine felt fresh tears threatening. "He did. The fault is entirely mine." Mrs. Watson moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "You planning to stay until the eastbound train?" I don't know what else to do." "Well, you can't just sit in this room for 3 weeks feeling sorry for yourself. That's no good for anyone." The older woman turned back to face her. "Can you read and write?" The question surprised Seraphine. "Yes, quite well, actually. I had an excellent education." "Can you do figures, mathematics?" "Yes." "Know anything about music?" Seraphine nodded slowly. "I can play piano, and I sing. I used to sing in my church back home." Mrs. Watson's expression softened slightly. "Minister Blackwood's wife, Sarah. She's been looking for someone to help with the children at the church school. Just temporary, mind you, until the regular teacher comes back from visiting her sick mother in Denver. It's only a few hours a day, and it doesn't pay much, but it's honest work." Seraphine's throat tightened. "I'm not sure I'd be welcome. By now everyone must know what happened, that I lied. Everyone knows a woman came to town expecting one thing and got another," Mrs. Watson interrupted firmly. What happens next is up to you. You can hide in this room, or you can hold your head up and show this town what you're really made of. Your choice, Miss Locke." After Mrs. Watson left, Seraphine ate the soup without tasting it, her mind churning. 3 weeks stretched before her like an eternity. She could spend them in this room, counting down the days until escape, nursing her shame and failure like open wounds. Or she could try, really try, not to win Reed Callahan back. That ship had sailed the moment he'd looked at her with those disappointed eyes, but to prove something to herself. To prove that she was more than the helpless ornament her world had shaped her to be. That night, Seraphine knelt beside her bed and prayed for the first time in months. Not the rote prayers of her youth, but honest, desperate words from a broken heart. "I've made such a mess of things," she whispered into the darkness. "I've lied and manipulated and hurt a good man who deserved better. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be anything other than what I was raised to be. But if you're listening, if you care about lost, foolish women who've run out of options and pride, please show me. Please help me find some way to be worth something again." The room offered no answer except silence and the distant sound of a piano playing somewhere in the town, a cheerful melody that felt like mockery. But in that silence, something settled in Seraphine's chest. Not peace exactly, not hope, not yet, but perhaps the smallest seed of determination. She would take Mrs. Watson's advice. She would meet with Minister Blackwood's wife. She would try. And maybe, just maybe, in 3 weeks when that eastbound train arrived, she would step onto it as someone different. Not the naive society girl who'd been destroyed by debt and disgrace. Not the desperate liar who'd gotten off the westbound train wrapped in silk and secrets. But someone new. Someone forged in the fires of humiliation and failure and honest effort. Someone she might actually be able to live with when she looked in the mirror. Outside her window, Montana night settled over Silver Falls like a dark blanket studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere out there, Reed Callahan was probably sitting on his porch, nursing his own disappointments under that same vast sky. Seraphine pressed her hand against the cool glass and whispered an apology the wind would never carry, a wish for his happiness that would never reach his ears, and a promise to herself that she would try to deserve the mercy he'd shown her, even if he never knew it. Even if she never saw him again. Even if the only person who ever witnessed her transformation was the broken woman staring back at her from the mirror, ready to finally start becoming someone worth being. The morning sun found Seraphine standing outside the white clapboard church at the edge of Silver Falls, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She'd spent an hour that morning trying to make herself presentable, choosing the simplest dress she owned, though even that was far too fine with its ivory linen and delicate embroidery. She'd pinned her hair back severely, removed all her jewelry except her mother's simple gold cross, and scrubbed her face until her cheeks were pink. Looking in the mirror, she'd seen someone caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The church door opened before she could knock, and a woman perhaps 10 years older than Seraphine appeared. She had warm brown eyes, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and flour dusting her apron. Her smile was cautious, but not unkind. "Miss Locke? I'm Sarah Blackwood. Martha Watson said you might come by." "Mrs. Blackwood." Seraphine's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I understand you need help with the church school. I wanted to offer my services, if you'll have me." Sarah studied her for a long moment, taking in the expensive dress, the soft hands, the cultured accent. Seraphine forced herself to meet that assessing gaze without flinching, though everything in her wanted to run. "Come inside," Sarah said finally, stepping back. "Let's talk." The church interior was simple but lovingly maintained. Wooden pews polished to a soft sheen, wildflowers in mason jars on the windowsills, a well-worn Bible on the pulpit. Sarah led her to a small room off the main sanctuary where 6 children of varying ages sat at rough-hewn desks, supposedly working on lessons but clearly more interested in whispering about the stranger. "Children," Sarah said firmly, "this is Miss Locke. She's going to help me for a while. I expect you to show her the same respect you show me. Understood?" A chorus of, "Yes, Mrs." Blackwood filled the room, though curious eyes never left Seraphine's face. Sarah gestured to a corner where they could speak quietly. "Martha tells me you can read, write, and cipher. Can you teach those skills to children who don't always want to learn? I can try, Seraphine said honestly. I've never taught before, but I had an excellent governess growing up. I know how she made lessons engaging. Can you keep order? Some of these children come from rough backgrounds. They'll test you. Seraphine thought of the debtors who'd cornered her in Atlanta, the sneering society matrons who'd turned their backs when her money disappeared, the desperate journey Wes built on lies and hope. I'm not as delicate as I look, Mrs. Blackwood. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Respect, maybe, or at least willingness to give her a chance. The pay is 50 cents a day, 4 days a week. You'll help with reading, writing, arithmetic, and whatever else needs doing. That includes cleaning the schoolroom, preparing materials, and occasionally helping with the younger children when they need, well, mothering. Can you do that? 50 cents a day. In her old life, Seraphine had spent that much on a single ribbon without thought. Now it felt like a fortune and an insult all at once. She swallowed her pride, what little remained, and nodded. Yes, ma'am. And Miss Locke, Sarah's voice dropped lower. I don't know what happened between you and Reed Callahan, and it's not my business. But this is a small town. People talk. If you're going to work here, you'll face questions and judgment. Can you handle that with grace? Seraphine met her eyes. I made mistakes, Mrs. Blackwood. Serious ones. But I'm trying to do better. That's all I can offer. Sarah nodded slowly. Then let's see what you're made of. Mary! She called to a girl of about 7 with braids and a suspicious expression. Come show Miss Locke your reader. The next 4 hours were the longest and most humbling of Seraphine's life. The children, sensing weakness like wolves sensing wounded prey, tested her mercilessly. They forgot their lessons. They squirmed and whispered and claimed not to understand instructions Seraphine had carefully explained 3 times. The older boys snickered at her accent. The girls examined her dress with barely concealed envy and resentment. But Seraphine had survived Atlanta society, where cruelty came wrapped in silk and served with tea. She held her ground, kept her voice steady, and discovered that her governess's techniques, making arithmetic into games, turning spelling into contests, reading aloud with theatrical flair, actually worked when she pushed past her nervousness to use them. By noon, when Sarah dismissed the children for lunch, Seraphine was exhausted, her throat dry from talking, her back aching from bending over desks to check work. But she'd survived. Not bad, Sarah said, handing her a cup of water. Young Thomas only threw 1 tantrum instead of his usual 3, and I saw Emily actually completing her sums. You've got a gift for making learning engaging. Thank you. Seraphine drank gratefully, then hesitated. Mrs. Blackwood, may I ask you something? Sarah, please, and yes. Why did you give me this chance? You don't know me. You only know that things didn't work out with Mr. Callahan. Sarah was quiet for a moment, gazing out the window at children playing in the churchyard. 5 years ago, I came to Silver Falls as a mail-order bride myself. I was supposed to marry a shopkeeper named William Blackwood. When I arrived, I discovered William had died 2 weeks earlier from pneumonia. His brother James, the minister, met me at the depot with the news and money to send me home. Seraphine's breath caught. What did you do? I stayed, told James I had nothing to go back to, and asked if the church needed help. He was skeptical, thought I was too soft for frontier life. But I was stubborn. Sarah smiled at the memory. I worked myself to the bone that first month, proving I could be useful. Burned more bread than I care to admit. Ruined 2 good dresses on thorns and rough work. Made a fool of myself more times than I can count. But you stayed. I stayed. And 6 months later, James proposed. Not because I was convenient or because he pitied me, but because he'd seen who I really was beneath the fancy traveling clothes and educated speech. He'd seen me fail and get up and try again. That meant something to him. Sarah turned to face Seraphine fully. I'm giving you a chance because someone gave me one. What you do with it is up to you. That afternoon, Seraphine cleaned the schoolroom until every surface shone, arranged the next day's lessons with meticulous care, and walked back to the hotel with her head high despite the stares and whispers that followed her through town. Her hands ached, her feet hurt. Her dress had a smudge of chalk on the sleeve that probably wouldn't come out. She'd never felt more accomplished. Over the next week, a rhythm emerged. Seraphine woke early, dressed in her plainest clothes, though everything she owned seemed ridiculously fine for frontier life, and walked to the church. She worked with the children from 8 until noon, learning their names, their struggles, their dreams. Tommy wanted to be a ranch foreman like his father. Mary loved stories and begged for one more chapter at the end of every lesson. The oldest boy, Daniel, was brilliant with numbers but couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes. In the afternoons, Sarah taught Seraphine the practical skills Eleanor had tried to impart, but Seraphine had only half learned. How to knead bread properly so it didn't turn into rocks. How to scrub clothes without shredding the fabric. How to mend a torn seam so it would hold under real work. How to start a fire in a temperamental stove and keep it burning at the right temperature. Seraphine failed. Repeatedly. Spectacularly. Her first loaf of bread came out so hard, Sarah joked they could use it as a doorstop. She scorched 2 fingers on the stove, earning a lecture about paying attention. She ruined a shirt by scrubbing it too aggressively against the washboard. But she learned. Slowly, painfully, with blistered hands and aching muscles, and more humiliation than she'd thought possible, she learned. The women of Silver Falls watched with open curiosity and varying degrees of skepticism. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, made pointed comments about fancy ladies playing at being useful. The seamstress, a sharp-eyed woman named Judith, examined Seraphine's increasingly worn dresses with knowing looks. Even kind Martha Watson occasionally reminded her that learning to bake bread didn't change what had happened at the depot. But Sarah stood firm. "She's working hard," she told the church ladies who gathered to gossip over quilting. "Whatever brought her here, she's trying. That counts for something." On Sunday, Seraphine attended church for the first time. She slipped into a back pew, acutely aware of eyes on her, whispers swirling like smoke. Minister Blackwood, a tall, serious man with Sarah's kind eyes, preached about forgiveness and second chances, and Seraphine wondered if Sarah had suggested the topic. When it came time for hymns, Seraphine hesitated, then let her voice join the congregation. She'd sung in church all her life, trained by expensive vocal instructors who'd praised her natural talent. Here, surrounded by rough frontiersmen and weathered ranch wives, she sang without showmanship, blending her voice with theirs in a way she'd never done in Atlanta's Grand Cathedral. After the service, a few people nodded to her, not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. It was a start. Reed Callahan wasn't there. Seraphine told herself she wasn't looking for him, wasn't disappointed by his absence. He had every right to avoid the church while she was there. She was the intruder, the liar, the unwanted complication in his carefully ordered life. That afternoon, sitting in her hotel room reviewing lessons for the coming week, Seraphine heard shouting from the street below. She went to the window and saw a crowd gathering near the general store. Something about a rider coming in fast, an emergency at one of the ranches. She watched as men mounted horses and rode out, heard fragments of conversation about a woman in difficult labor, the midwife out of town, someone needed now. Her heart clenched with an old, half-forgotten knowledge. Childbirth complications, the medical texts her father's library had contained, the anatomy lessons considered scandalous for young ladies, but which her progressive mother had insisted she learn. But this wasn't her concern. She wasn't part of this community. Not really. She was just passing through, counting down days until her escape. The thought rang hollow even as she tried to believe it. By the end of the second week, Seraphine had fallen into a pattern that felt almost like belonging. She knew the shopkeeper's name, Harold, and he no longer charged her outsider prices. She knew which families were struggling and which children came to school hungry, and she'd quietly started setting aside part of her meager pay to buy extra bread to leave accidentally on their desks. She knew that Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, was from San Francisco and desperately homesick, and that a few kind words in passing could make her whole face light up. She also knew that Reed Callahan came to town on Thursdays for supplies, and she'd learned to time her errands so their paths wouldn't cross. The one time she'd glimpsed him from a distance, her heart had stuttered painfully, and she'd quickly turned down a side street like the coward she was. On Friday of that second week, Seraphine stood in front of her students, leading them through a geography lesson, when young Mary raised her hand. "Yes, Mary?" "Miss Locke, is it true you came here to marry Mr. Callahan, but you lied about who you were and he sent you away?" The room went dead silent. Every child stared at her, curiosity and judgment warring in their young faces. Seraphine felt her cheeks burn, her throat close. She could deflect, change the subject, assert authority, and shut down the question. Or she could tell the truth. "Yes," she said quietly, setting down her book. "That's true." "Why'd you lie?" This from Daniel, the oldest boy, his tone challenging. "Because I was scared and desperate, and I made a very bad choice," Seraphine said, meeting his eyes. "I thought I could pretend to be someone I wasn't, and I hurt a good man who deserved honesty. It was wrong, and I've been trying to make amends ever since." "Are you sorry?" Mary's voice was small but insistent. "Very sorry. More than I can express." Tommy, the ranch foreman's son, frowned thoughtfully. "My pa says sometimes people make mistakes, but what matters is if they learn from them." "Your pa is a wise man," Seraphine said, her voice tight with emotion. "My ma says you're putting on airs, pretending to be humble, but really you think you're better than us." This from Ruth, a girl of 12 with her mother's sharp tongue. The words stung, but Seraphine forced herself to consider them honestly. "I probably have put on airs without realizing it. Old habits are hard to break, but I don't think I'm better than anyone. If anything, I'm learning just how much I don't know, how much I've had to learn from all of you and your families about real strength and real work." Sarah, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped in. "That's enough questions, children. Back to geography." But something had shifted. The children's wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it softened. They watched her differently now, not as an exotic creature from another world, but as a real person who'd made mistakes and was trying to do better. That afternoon, as Seraphine was sweeping the schoolroom, Sarah approached with an unusual expression on her face. "There's a situation," she said without preamble. "Grace Thompson, from one of the smaller ranches about 10 miles out, is having a difficult birth. The baby's coming early, and the midwife is in Helena delivering another child. Dr. Morrison rode out there 2 hours ago, but a rider just came back saying the doctor needs help, someone with steady hands and nerve who can follow instructions." Seraphine's heart began to pound. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Martha Watson mentioned you had an unusually thorough education for a woman, that you'd studied things most young ladies wouldn't." Sarah's gaze was steady, assessing. "Did you study medicine, anatomy?" "Some," Seraphine admitted. "My mother believed women should understand their own bodies, the birthing process. She had medical texts in her library. I read them, studied them. But Sarah, I've never attended a birth. I've only read about it." "Dr. Morrison has. He just needs an assistant who won't faint at the sight of blood and can hand him instruments when he needs them. Can you do that?" Every instinct screamed at Seraphine to refuse. This was beyond her capabilities, beyond her experience. If something went wrong, if the woman died or the baby died, the town would blame her. She'd be marked as a failure again, but this time with blood on her hands. But a woman was dying, a baby was dying, and she had knowledge, however theoretical, that might help. "I'll go," she heard herself say. "Good." Sarah was already moving. "There's a wagon waiting. James will drive you. Pack whatever you might need." 15 minutes later, Seraphine was rattling through the Montana countryside in a wagon driven by Minister Blackwood, her medical knowledge frantically reviewing itself in her head. Presentation positions, cord complications, hemorrhage protocols. The textbook illustrations she'd studied years ago flashed behind her eyes. "You're very pale," James observed, his voice calm in the way of men who regularly dealt with crisis. "I'm terrified," Seraphine admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you careful. Grace Thompson is a strong woman, but this is her first child and it's not going well. Her husband Matthew is beside himself. Dr. Morrison is excellent, but he's 70 years old and his hands shake. He needs your steadiness. What if I fail? What if she dies because I don't know enough, can't do enough? What if she dies because you were too afraid to try?" James countered gently. "You're not going there to perform miracles, Miss Locke. You're going to help where you can and trust God for the rest." The Thompson ranch was small but neat, with a tidy cabin and a barn that spoke of hard work and careful maintenance. Matthew Thompson met them at the door, his face gray with fear and exhaustion. "Thank God. The doc's in there, but he's struggling. She's been laboring for 18 hours and the baby's stuck somehow. There's so much blood. His voice cracked. Seraphine followed James inside, her heart hammering. The cabin's main room had been converted into a makeshift delivery room. Grace Thompson lay on the bed, her face contorted in pain, her nightgown soaked with sweat and blood. Dr. Morrison, a white-haired man with trembling hands and fierce determination, looked up as they entered. "You the girl with medical knowledge?" "I've studied anatomy and obstetrics from textbooks," Seraphine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've never practiced." "Better than nothing. Wash your hands, thoroughly, with that carbolic solution there. Then get over here. This baby's breech, and we're running out of time." For the next 3 hours, Seraphine existed in a world narrowed to the laboring woman, the struggling baby, and Dr. Morrison's terse instructions. She handed him instruments, her hands steady despite her terror. She pressed cloths to Grace's forehead, murmured encouragement when the woman's screams faded to exhausted whimpers. She held limbs when the doctor needed to manipulate the baby's position, trying to turn the child without tearing the mother apart. Blood soaked through her dress, the ivory linen she'd worn to look respectable, now ruined beyond redemption. Her arms ached from holding positions. Her back screamed from bending over the bed. But she didn't flinch, didn't falter, didn't let the horror of what she was seeing break through her focus. "There," Dr. Morrison said suddenly. "There! I've got the legs. Miss Locke, when I tell you you'll need to push here." He indicated Grace's abdomen, firmly but carefully. "Can you do that?" "Yes." No hesitation, though she'd never done anything like it. "Now!" Seraphine pushed, Grace screamed, and suddenly there was movement, release, and then, impossibly, miraculously, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. "It's a girl," Dr. Morrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "A fighter like her mother. Miss Locke, take her, clean her up while I tend to Grace. There's still bleeding I need to address." Seraphine found herself holding a tiny, bloody, screaming infant who looked absolutely furious at being born. Her hands, which had been so steady through the delivery, now trembled as she gently cleaned the baby, following the doctor's instructions. The child was small but fierce, her lungs clearly working well despite her early arrival. "She's beautiful," Grace whispered from the bed, her voice weak but filled with wonder. "Let me see her." Carefully, Seraphine placed the cleaned, wrapped baby in her mother's arms, watching as Grace's face transformed with a love so pure and powerful it made Seraphine's throat close with emotion. "Thank you," Grace breathed, looking up at Seraphine with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving us." "Dr. Morrison did the saving," Seraphine said, stepping back. "I just helped." "You did more than help." This from the doctor himself, washing his hands in the basin. "You kept your head when most women would have fainted or fled. You followed instructions precisely. You've got good instincts, girl, natural healer's hands." Outside, as dawn broke over the Montana prairie, Seraphine sat on the cabin's porch step and let the tears finally come. James Blackwood sat beside her, silent and solid, letting her cry without judgment. "I was so scared," she whispered. "The whole time, I was terrified I'd do something wrong, that they'd die because of me." "But they didn't. They lived because of you, because you were brave enough to try." Seraphine looked down at her hands, blistered from scrubbing, stained with blood that wouldn't wash completely away, trembling with exhaustion and relief. These weren't the soft, useless hands of a society ornament. They were the hands of someone who'd helped bring life into the world. Maybe, just maybe, they were the hands of someone who could survive out here after all. When they returned to Silver Falls, news of the dramatic birth had already spread. Women who'd barely acknowledged Seraphine before stopped her on the street to thank her, to tell her about their own difficult deliveries, to include her, if only for a moment, in the sacred circle of mothers and survivors. But it was Sarah's words that night, as Seraphine collapsed in her hotel room, still wearing the ruined dress, that broke through her defenses entirely. "You found your courage today," Sarah said simply. "The kind that can't be taught or faked, the kind that frontier life demands. You should be proud." Proud. Seraphine turned the word over in her mind as Sarah left. Could she be proud of herself? She who'd lied and schemed and arrived wrapped in deception? She who'd spent 2 weeks learning basic skills most women mastered as children? But she'd also kept her head during a crisis. She'd saved a life, maybe two lives. She'd stood firm when everything in her wanted to run. That night, lying in bed too exhausted to even remove her clothes properly, Seraphine thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that train. That Seraphine would have fainted at the first sight of blood. She would have fled from honest work, from children's questions, from the judgment in people's eyes. But that Seraphine was dying, being burned away by frontier sun and honest effort, and the slow, painful process of becoming something new, something real, something that might actually be worth the space it occupied in the world. She fell asleep still wearing Grace Thompson's blood on her hands, and dreamed of a baby's cry and a mother's grateful tears and the strange, powerful feeling of being genuinely needed for the first time in her life. The Thompson baby's safe arrival changed something fundamental in how Silver Falls regarded Seraphine Locke. When she walked to the church school Monday morning, women who'd previously looked through her as if she were invisible now nodded greetings. Mrs. Henderson, who'd made the sharpest comments about fancy ladies, stopped her outside the general store. "My daughter had a difficult birth last year," the banker's wife said abruptly, her usual hauteur cracking to reveal something raw underneath. "Lost the baby. If someone like you had been there, someone with learning and steady hands, maybe—" She trailed off, then cleared her throat. "What I'm saying is, thank you for helping Grace. That took real courage." Seraphine didn't know how to respond to praise that felt both deserved and entirely unearned. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Most people would have been too scared or too proud or too convinced they couldn't help. You tried. That matters." She paused, then added, "I judged you harshly when you first arrived. I apologize for that." The apology stunned Seraphine more than anything else that had happened since she'd stepped off that train. She managed a quiet "thank you" before Mrs. Henderson nodded briskly and continued on her way, leaving Seraphine standing on the wooden sidewalk feeling oddly unbalanced, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted in some imperceptible way. At the church school, the children greeted her with new respect mixed with morbid curiosity. Tommy cornered her during the morning break, his eyes wide. "Is it true there was blood everywhere? That the baby was stuck and might have died?" "Thomas Henry Morrison, that is not appropriate conversation," Sarah called from across the room, but her tone was mild. "It's all right," Seraphine said, kneeling to Tommy's level. "Yes, there was blood. Birth is hard, dangerous work. But Dr. Morrison knew exactly what to do, and the baby is healthy now. That's what matters." "Were you scared?" This from Mary, who'd crept closer to listen. Seraphine met the little girl's eyes honestly. "Terrified. But sometimes we have to do hard things even when we're afraid. That's what bravery really is." "Like you staying here even though people were mean to you?" Mary asked with the devastating directness of children. "Yes," Seraphine said softly. "Exactly like that." The days accumulated like coins in a purse, each one adding weight and value to Seraphine's transformation. She burned less bread, though her loaves still came out dense and heavy compared to Sarah's feather-light creations. She could now start the temperamental stove without Sarah's help, though she still occasionally singed her fingers. Her hands, once soft as rose petals, developed calluses on the palms and a perpetual redness from washing in harsh lye soap. Her dresses, already worn from 2 weeks of frontier life, began showing serious deterioration. Hems fraying, seams splitting, the fine fabrics never meant for such rough use falling apart under the strain. On Thursday of the third week, 1 week before the eastbound train was scheduled to arrive, Seraphine was mending yet another torn seam in her second-to-last decent dress when Sarah found her in the church workroom. "There's someone here to see you," Sarah said, her expression carefully neutral in a way that made Seraphine's heart skip. "Who?" "Matthew Thompson, and he's not alone." Seraphine set down her mending and followed Sarah into the church sanctuary. Matthew Thompson stood near the door, hat in hands, looking uncomfortable in clean Sunday clothes despite it being a weekday. Beside him stood Grace, pale but glowing with new motherhood, holding a bundle that could only be the baby. And behind them, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and an expression Seraphine couldn't read, stood Reed Callahan. The air left Seraphine's lungs in a rush. She hadn't seen Reed up close since that devastating conversation in the hotel dining room 3 weeks ago. He looked exactly the same, weathered, solid, real, in a way that made everything else feel insubstantial. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something different. Not the disappointment and finality she remembered, but something more complex. Curiosity, maybe. Or reassessment. "Miss Locke," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "We wanted to thank you properly. What you did—" He stopped, overcome, and Grace stepped forward. "You saved our lives," she said simply. "Mine and Caroline's both. The doctor said without your help, we likely would have bled out before he could manage the delivery alone. We owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," Seraphine protested. "Dr. Morrison did all the real work. I just handed him instruments." "You did considerably more than that," a new voice said, and Dr. Morrison himself shuffled into the sanctuary, leaning on his cane. "You kept your head during a crisis that would have broken most people. You followed complex medical instructions precisely under extreme pressure, and you showed a natural aptitude for healing work that frankly surprised me." He fixed her with a sharp look. "Have you considered studying medicine formally? There are medical colleges for women now, in Philadelphia and Boston." The suggestion was so absurd that Seraphine almost laughed. "I have no money for such schooling, doctor, and in a week I'll be on a train back east to find whatever employment I can." "About that." This from Reed, his first words, and Seraphine's attention snapped to him like a compass finding north. He pushed off from the door frame, moving into the sanctuary proper. "Matthew came to my ranch yesterday to tell me what happened. About how you helped Grace and the baby." "I see." Seraphine forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, though her heart was hammering. "I hope the news didn't trouble you." Something flickered across Reed's face. Surprise, maybe, or respect for her directness. "Trouble isn't the word I'd use. It made me think. Made me wonder if I'd been too hasty in my judgment." The church had gone very quiet. Sarah had discreetly ushered Matthew, Grace, and Dr. Morrison toward the door, giving Reed and Seraphine privacy, while remaining close enough to preserve propriety. Seraphine could hear her own breathing, loud in the stillness. "You weren't hasty," she said quietly. "You were right. I lied to you, deceived you, showed up completely unprepared for the life you needed a partner for. Everything you said in that hotel room was true." "Was," Reed repeated, emphasis on the past tense. "But I'm hearing different stories now, about you working at the church school, teaching children who don't make it easy, learning skills you never had to know before, helping save a woman's life when you could have stayed safe in your hotel room. I'm still the same person who lied to you." "Are you?" Reed took a step closer, and Seraphine's breath caught. "Because the woman I sent away 3 weeks ago wouldn't have calluses on her hands, wouldn't have flour in her hair right now." He gestured, and Seraphine's hand flew self-consciously to her head, finding the telltale white dust. "Wouldn't be wearing a dress that's been mended so many times, I can see the different thread colors from here." Heat flooded Seraphine's cheeks. She'd thought herself presentable, but through Reed's eyes she saw herself clearly, worn, patched, marked by honest labor in a way no amount of silk and jewelry could hide. Part of her wanted to be mortified. The other part, the part that was slowly, painfully being born from the ashes of who she'd been, felt oddly proud. "I've been learning," she said simply, "trying to become someone useful instead of just ornamental. It's harder than I expected. I fail more than I succeed. But I'm trying." "I can see that," Reed's voice had gentled. "The whole town can see that. You've earned respect here, Seraphine. Real respect, not the kind that comes from fancy clothes or family names." The sound of her given name in his voice made something in her chest ache. "That doesn't change what I did. What I am." "What you were," Reed corrected. "People change. I've seen it happen. Question is whether you're changing because you have to or because you want to." Seraphine considered this, really considered it. 3 weeks ago, she would have said necessity drove everything, the need to survive, to eat, to have shelter and safety. But now? Both, she admitted. I needed to learn these things to survive. But somewhere along the way, I started wanting to be the kind of person who could do them. Who could help Grace Thompson without feigning? Who could teach children without condescending to them? Who could... She trailed off, unable to finish. Who could be a real partner to someone instead of a burden? Reed supplied gently. Yes. The word came out as barely a whisper. Reed was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if looking for answers to questions he hadn't voiced. Finally, he said, "The train leaves in a week. You planning to be on it?" "I don't know," Seraphine said honestly. "I have a ticket. I have enough money to start over somewhere back east, maybe find work as a governess or companion. It would be sensible, safe. But I've discovered I don't want safe anymore. I want—" She struggled to articulate the longing that had been growing in her chest, the feeling that had bloomed when she'd held Grace's baby and seen the children's faces light up over a well-told story and felt her own hands, rough and capable, kneading bread that would actually feed people. "I want to matter, to be genuinely useful, to build something real instead of just surviving on the edges of other people's lives. And you think you can find that here, in Silver Falls?" Seraphine met his eyes fully, letting him see the truth in hers. "I think I've already started finding it. The question is whether there's room for me to stay, whether the town would accept me as more than just a temporary charity case, whether—" She couldn't finish, couldn't ask the question that really mattered. Reed seemed to understand anyway. "Whether I'd be willing to reconsider what I said in that hotel room." "You don't owe me reconsideration," Seraphine said quickly. "I wronged you. You made the right choice." "Maybe I did. Maybe I made the smart, practical, safe choice." Reed took another step closer, close enough that Seraphine could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could smell the scent of leather and horses and honest work that clung to him. "But watching Matthew Thompson hold his baby daughter yesterday, seeing his wife alive because you were brave enough to help when you didn't have to be, I realized something. Sometimes the smart choice isn't the right choice. Sometimes the right choice is the one that scares you." Seraphine's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to start over, not pick up where we left off. That arrangement was built on lies and it needed to end. But start fresh, honest, with the people we actually are instead of who we pretended to be or thought we needed to be." He paused, then added, "If you're willing." The offer hung between them, precious and terrifying. Seraphine wanted to say yes immediately, to grab the second chance with both hands and never let go. But 3 weeks of hard lessons had taught her something about honesty. "I'm still learning," she said carefully. "I can bake bread that won't break teeth, but it's not good bread. I can mend and clean and teach, but I'm clumsy at all of it. I have no experience running a household or managing a ranch or any of the 100 things a frontier wife needs to know. I might fail. I probably will fail at many things." "Probably," Reed agreed, but his eyes were warm. "I fail at things too. Burned my dinner 3 nights this week because I was distracted. Lost 6 head of cattle to a break in the fence I should have noticed earlier. Said things in that hotel room I've been regretting for 2 weeks straight." "You had every right to say those things. Having the right doesn't make them kind. Doesn't make them complete truth either. I said you'd be useless on a ranch, that you couldn't be a real partner. But watching you these past weeks, and yes, I've been watching, don't look so surprised. I've seen you become exactly the kind of person who could be a partner. Someone who doesn't give up when things get hard. Someone who keeps trying even when they fail. Someone brave enough to help a stranger in crisis." He took a breath. "Someone I'd like to know better. Honestly, this time. No pretense." "A courtship," Seraphine said slowly, testing the word. "A real one. A proper one. I come calling at the hotel, we take walks, we talk about real things, our lives, our hopes, our fears. We let the town see us figuring out if we suit each other. We do this the right way, the way I should have insisted on from the start. And if we discover we don't suit, if I'm still too different, too impractical, then we shake hands and part as friends, and you get on that train with my blessing and best wishes," Reed interrupted. "But Seraphine, I don't think that's what will happen. I think we might surprise ourselves." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But fear held her back. Fear of failing again, of disappointing him again, of discovering that 3 weeks of progress wasn't enough to bridge the canyon between who she'd been raised to be and who frontier life demanded. As if reading her thoughts, Reed said quietly, "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. Pray about it if that helps. But know this, I'm not offering out of pity or obligation. I'm offering because I see something in you worth knowing, something real and brave and honestly beautiful that has nothing to do with silk dresses or family names. Before Seraphine could respond, the church door opened and a young boy burst in, breathless and wild-eyed. Miss Locke, Mrs. Blackwood, come quick. There's a storm coming and the McCready kids are missing. The moment shattered. Reed turned immediately to the boy. What do you mean missing? The three youngest went out to check the traps this morning and haven't come back. Storm's rolling in fast from the north. You can see it from the ridge. Mr. McCready's organizing search parties, but he said to fetch anyone who can help. Sarah appeared from wherever she'd been discreetly waiting. How long have they been gone? 4 hours, ma'am. They only had light jackets. If they get caught in that storm. The boy didn't need to finish. Everyone in Montana Territory knew what mountain storms could do to children caught unprepared. I'm going, Reed said immediately. Sarah, tell James to ring the church bell. That'll bring in anyone close enough to help. We need to organize search grids before that weather hits. I'm coming too. The words were out of Seraphine's mouth before her brain caught up. Reed turned to her, frowning. Seraphine, this isn't... Those children are my students, she interrupted. Lily, James, and little Michael. They're 8, 6, and 4 years old. I'm coming. Do you know how to ride? Really ride, not just a lady's trot through a park. No, she admitted. But I can learn quickly, or I can go in a wagon, walk if I have to. I'm coming, Reed. Don't try to stop me. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to what looked like pride. All right, but you follow orders and you stay with the group. Understood? Understood. What followed was controlled chaos. The church bell rang, its urgent clanging bringing people running from all directions. Reed organized the growing crowd with the calm authority of a man used to managing difficult situations, dividing searchers into groups, assigning areas, establishing a base camp at the McCready homestead. The storm was visible now, a dark wall rolling across the northern sky with terrifying speed. Seraphine found herself in a wagon driven by Sarah, part of a group heading toward the eastern search grid, where the children had last been seen. Reed and several other experienced riders took horses to cover more ground quickly. The air had that electric quality that preceded mountain storms, and the temperature was already dropping. Those children have some sense, Sarah said as they rattled along the rough track. They'll look for shelter when the storm hits. Question is whether they can find it in time. Seraphine thought of little Michael McCready, barely 4 years old, who still cried sometimes when his mother left him at school. She thought of Lily, bright and curious and entirely too adventurous. She thought of James, the responsible middle child who probably felt like this was all his fault. We'll find them, she said, with more confidence than she felt. The search lasted 3 hours that felt like 3 years. Seraphine scrambled through underbrush that tore at her already damaged dress, called names until her throat was raw, pushed past exhaustion and fear and the first stinging drops of icy rain. The storm hit with the sudden fury of mountain weather, wind howling through the trees and rain turning to sleet that cut like knives. They'd found nothing, no sign of the children, no response to their calls, nothing but wilderness growing more hostile by the minute. Sarah was trying to convince their group to return to base camp when a rider appeared through the driving sleet, Reed, soaked to the bone, his face grim. Any luck? He called over the wind. Nothing, Sarah called back. You? Northern team found tracks heading toward the old Miller homestead. There's a root cellar there. If the kids knew about it, they might have sheltered there. I'm heading there now. It's rough terrain. I'm coming, Seraphine said, already moving toward his horse. Reed didn't argue, just reached down and hauled her up behind him with surprising ease. Hold on tight, he ordered, and then they were moving, the horse picking its way through increasingly treacherous ground, while Seraphine clung to Reed's waist, her face pressed against his back for shelter from the sleet. The old Miller place was a ruin, a collapsed cabin and a barely visible mound that marked the root cellar. Reed dismounted and helped Seraphine down, then approached the cellar door carefully. It was closed, which could mean nothing or everything. Lily, James, Michael, Reed called. It's Mr. Callahan and Miss Locke. If you're in there, make noise. For a terrible moment, there was nothing but wind and sleet. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a child's voice. "We're here! We're here!" Relief nearly buckled Seraphine's knees. Reed yanked open the heavy door to reveal 3 small, terrified, shivering children huddled together in the darkness below. Michael was crying, Lily looked pale as death, and James was trying so hard to be brave that it broke Seraphine's heart. "It's all right," Reed said, his voice gentle despite the urgency. "We've got you now. Come on up, carefully." Getting the children out, warmed and back to the McCready homestead, took another hour of careful work. Reed gave up his coat to wrap around the 2 younger children, leaving himself in just a thin shirt against the storm. Seraphine held Michael in front of her on the horse, the little boy's sobs gradually quieting against her chest, while she murmured reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. By the time they reached the homestead, both Reed and Seraphine were soaked through and shaking with cold, but the children were safe. Mrs. McCready fell on her babies with tears streaming down her face, and Mr. McCready gripped Reed's hand so hard Seraphine thought bones might crack. "Thank you," he said roughly. "Thank you both. If you hadn't found them—" "But we did," Reed said firmly. "They're safe. That's what matters." Inside, while Mrs. McCready tended to her children and the other searchers arrived with relief and exhaustion, Seraphine found herself wrapped in a borrowed blanket by the fire, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Reed sat beside her, equally soaked, steam rising from their clothes. "You did well out there," he said quietly. "Didn't slow us down, didn't panic, kept young Michael calm. That took real courage." "I was terrified the whole time," Seraphine admitted, her voice shaking from cold and delayed reaction. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." Reed turned to look at her fully, and in the firelight his eyes were warm and honest and entirely without the judgment she'd grown so used to seeing there. "You've got more strength than you give yourself credit for, Seraphine Locke. More than I gave you credit for, certainly. I had good motivation. Those children trust me. I couldn't let them down." "You didn't. You never have, not since you started teaching them." He paused, then said, "That courtship offer still stands. More than ever, actually, if you're interested." Seraphine looked around the room, at the McCready children safe and warm, at Sarah smiling at her with approval, at the townspeople who'd risked themselves in a storm to find 3 missing kids. She looked at Reed beside her, solid and real, and offering something she'd never thought to find, a genuine second chance. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'm interested." Reed's face broke into a smile that transformed him entirely, erasing years of loneliness and turning him young. "Good. Then tomorrow, if you're willing, I'd like to call on you properly. Take a walk, maybe. Talk about who we really are and what we really want." "I'd like that very much." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the McCready homestead, wrapped in borrowed blankets by a warm fire, surrounded by people who'd become something like community, Seraphine felt something unfurl in her chest that might have been hope. Real hope. Not the desperate grasping kind that had brought her west on a lie, but the kind built on honest effort and genuine connection and the slow, painful, beautiful process of becoming someone worth being. She'd come to Montana as a beautiful fraud running from debts and disgrace. She'd been rejected, humiliated, forced to start over from nothing with skills she didn't possess and pride she couldn't afford. But she'd survived. More than survived, she'd grown, changed, become someone who could help birth babies and teach children and search through storms for lost souls. Someone who could look a good man in the eyes and accept a second chance, not because she was desperate, but because she'd earned it. The woman who'd stepped off that train 3 weeks ago was gone, burned away in the fires of failure and effort and grace. In her place sat someone new, someone still learning and still stumbling, but fundamentally different. Someone who might actually deserve Reed Callahan's quiet smile and honest respect. Someone who might actually belong in this hard, beautiful place after all. Reed Callahan appeared at the Silver Creek Hotel at precisely 2 o'clock the following afternoon, wearing clean clothes and an expression that somehow managed to be both confident and nervous. Seraphine watched him from her window as he tied his horse to the hitching post, removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, then replaced the hat and seemed to steel himself before entering the hotel. She'd spent the morning in an agony of indecision over what to wear. Every dress she owned was either too fine for a simple walk or so worn it barely qualified as decent. She finally settled on a dark blue cotton that had once been her plainest day dress but now bore the marks of 3 weeks in Montana. A mended tear at the hem, a faded patch where she'd scrubbed out a stain, sleeves that she'd had to let out after the fabric shrank from too vigorous washing. Looking at herself in the small mirror, she saw someone caught between worlds, too rough for Atlanta society, too refined for frontier practicality. But her hair, simply braided and coiled, was her own. Her face, free of the rice powder and carefully applied cosmetics she'd once considered essential, was honest. And her hands, calloused and reddened, were the hands of someone who'd worked. A knock on the door made her jump. Martha Watson's voice called through, warm with barely suppressed amusement. "Miss Locke, you have a gentleman caller." Seraphine took a breath, smoothed her skirts, and opened the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Watson. I'll be right down." Reed stood in the hotel's small parlor, hat in hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable among the doilies and delicate furniture. When Seraphine descended the stairs, his eyes tracked her movement, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You look lovely," he said simply. "I look worn," Seraphine corrected, but without the shame she might have felt a week ago. "But thank you." "I meant it. You look real. That's worth more than lovely." Martha Watson appeared with a knowing smile. "I'll just be in the kitchen if you need anything. The parlor's available for sitting, or there's the porch if you prefer fresh air." "I thought we might take a walk," Reed said, looking to Seraphine for confirmation. "If that's agreeable to you." "Very agreeable." They walked through Silver Falls in broad daylight, and Seraphine was acutely aware of eyes on them from every window and doorway. The town was small enough that Reed Callahan courting the woman who'd arrived as his mail-order bride and been sent away was news of the most delicious kind. But Reed seemed unbothered by the attention, nodding greetings to people they passed, his stride unhurried and confident. "Does the scrutiny bother you?" Seraphine asked quietly as they left the main street behind, heading toward a path that led along the creek. "Some," Reed admitted. "I'm a private man by nature, but I figure people will talk regardless of what we do. Might as well give them something worth talking about." "And this is worth talking about? Courting a woman who lied to you?" Reed stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The creek burbled beside them, and cottonwood trees rustled overhead in the gentle breeze. "I think we need to lay something to rest right now. Yes, you lied about who you were when you came here. Yes, that was wrong. But Seraphine, you've apologized, you've shown genuine remorse, and you've spent 3 weeks proving through actions that you're not that desperate woman anymore. At some point, we both need to forgive you for that mistake. I already have. Question is, have you forgiven yourself?" The question struck deeper than Seraphine expected. Had she forgiven herself? Or was she still carrying that shame like a heavy stone, letting it color every interaction, every moment of potential happiness? "I'm trying to," she said honestly. "But it's hard. When I look at you, I remember sitting in that hotel dining room, watching hope die in your eyes. I remember how kind you were even as you sent me away. I remember thinking I'd destroyed something before it even had a chance to begin." "You didn't destroy it," Reed said gently. "You postponed it. Maybe made it better, even. If I'd married the woman who stepped off that train, I would have gotten someone play-acting at being a ranch wife. Now I have the chance to court someone who's actually becoming the kind of woman who could thrive here. That's worth the wait." They resumed walking, their shoulders occasionally brushing in a way that made Seraphine intensely aware of every point of near contact. The path followed this creek into prettier country, where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh Montana sun, and the water ran clear over smooth stones. "Tell me about your ranch," Seraphine said, genuinely curious. "In your letters, Eleanor's letters, I mean, you wrote about it, but I'd like to hear it in your own words." Reed's face transformed when he talked about his land. He spoke of buying the initial parcel 8 years ago, with money saved from working as a ranch hand for other men, of slowly expanding as he could afford it, of building the house himself with help from neighboring ranchers. He talked about the cattle, the horses, the challenges of harsh winters and occasional droughts, the satisfaction of watching something grow from nothing but sweat and determination. It's not easy work, he said, his honesty refreshing after a lifetime of men posturing and exaggerating. Some years we barely break even. There are weeks where I'm up before dawn and working until I can't see straight. The winters are brutal. Temperatures drop so low that water freezes in minutes, and you have to check the cattle constantly to make sure none are dying. But it's mine, built with my own hands and choices. That means something. It sounds lonely, Seraphine observed quietly. Reed was silent for a moment. It is. That's why I placed that advertisement. I wanted someone to share it with, someone who'd understand why I work so hard, why it matters. My mother used to say a life without someone to share it with is only half a life, no matter how successful you are. Your mother sounds wise. Is she? Passed 5 years ago. Pneumonia. My father went 2 years before that. Heart gave out during a hard winter. Reed's voice was steady, but Seraphine heard the grief underneath. They built their ranch together, worked side by side for 30 years. That's what I wanted. A true partner, not just a wife. And you thought Eleanor, the woman you believed I was, could be that partner? I hoped so. Her letters were promising, but honestly? Reed glanced at her with a rueful smile. I was probably building up an idealized version in my head. When you stepped off that train looking like you'd walked out of a painting, my first thought was panic, because I knew immediately you weren't what I'd expected. My second thought, and I'm not proud of this, was that you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and I couldn't quite believe she'd come all this way for me. Heat flooded Seraphine's cheeks. That woman was a lie. Her circumstances were a lie. But she was still you, just a version of you that hadn't been tested yet. Reed stopped walking again, this time turning her gently to face him with a hand on her arm. Seraphine, I need you to understand something. I'm not courting who you used to be or even who you're becoming. I'm courting who you are right now in this moment. Someone brave and honest and trying her damnedest to build something real from the ruins of a life that fell apart. That woman? She's worth knowing. Tears pricked Seraphine's eyes. How can you be so kind to me after what I did? Because I've made mistakes too. Because everyone deserves a second chance when they're genuinely trying to do better. Because he stopped, seeming to wrestle with something, then continued. Because when I saw you in that root cellar yesterday, soaked and freezing, but holding young Michael McCready like he was the most precious thing in the world, talking him through his fear, I realized something. The woman I thought I wanted from those letters, she was safe, predictable, easy to imagine a life with because nothing about her challenged me or surprised me. But you terrify me and intrigue me in equal measure, and I think maybe that's what I actually need. I terrify you? Seraphine's voice came out barely above a whisper. Absolutely. You're this force of nature wrapped up in silk that's falling apart at the seams. You fail spectacularly at things, and then get up and try again without complaint. You dive into crises that would make most people run. You're nothing like what I thought I wanted, and that scares me because it means I have to let go of my careful plans and just see where this leads. He smiled, warm and genuine. But I'm willing to be scared if you are. I've been scared since the moment I stepped on that train in Atlanta, Seraphine admitted. Scared of failing, scared of being found out, scared of ending up alone and destitute. But somehow, being scared with you feels different. Feels like maybe the fear is worth it. They stood there by the creek, the Montana afternoon golden around them, and something passed between them that felt like a promise. Not the formal promises they might have made if that original arrangement had proceeded, but something more fragile and more real. The promise to try, to be honest, to see if this unexpected connection could grow into something lasting. Reed offered his arm, and Seraphine took it, feeling the solid strength of him through the fabric of his shirt. They walked further, and he told her about the ranch in more detail, the layout of the house, the challenges of the coming winter, his hopes for expanding the herd next spring. She told him about teaching the children, about her growing friendship with Sarah, about the strange satisfaction of baking bread that was merely adequate instead of inedible. There's something you should know, Reed said eventually, his tone growing more serious. If this courtship progresses, if we decide we suit each other, my life isn't going to suddenly become easy. I can provide for a wife, make sure she's fed and clothed and safe, but it won't be the life you're used to. No servants, no social events, no fine dresses or jewelry, Just hard work and long days and hoping the weather cooperates and the cattle stay healthy. Reed, Seraphine said gently, the life I was used to ended 3 years ago when my father died and the debts came due. Since then, I've lived in steadily deteriorating circumstances, selling everything I owned piece by piece, watching so-called friends disappear when the money did. The fine dresses I'm wearing, they're all I have left, and they're falling apart because they were never meant for real life. I don't miss that world. I miss the security, sometimes, but not the world itself. What do you want, then? If you could have anything? The question made Seraphine pause and really consider. What did she want? 3 weeks ago, she would have said safety, a roof over her head, freedom from debt collectors and desperation. But now? I want to be useful, she said slowly. I want to wake up knowing my day has purpose beyond just surviving. I want to teach children who actually want to learn. I want to help women like Grace Thompson. I want to build something, maybe not a ranch, but something real and lasting. And I want... She trailed off, unsure if she should continue. Tell me, Reed encouraged. I want to be loved for who I actually am, not for my family's money or social connections or the person I'm pretending to be. I want someone to see me, really see me, with all my failures and rough edges and the person I'm still becoming, and choose me anyway. Reed stopped walking, pulling her to a halt beside him. The creek sang its endless song, and overhead a hawk circled in the endless blue sky. Seraphina Locke, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I see you, the woman who burned bread and tried again, who helped save a baby with shaking hands and iron will, who searched through a storm for lost children without a moment's hesitation, who teaches with patience and cleanse without complaint, and is learning to be strong in ways you never knew you needed. I see you, and I'm choosing to stand here courting you, knowing full well you might decide I'm not worth the trouble. You're worth the trouble, Seraphine said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. You're worth everything. Something blazed in Reed's eyes, and for a moment Seraphine thought he might kiss her right there by the creek. But he was an honorable man, and proper courtship had standards. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that burned through her skin like a brand. We're going to do this right, he said firmly. Court properly. Take our time. Let everyone see this is real and honest. No rushing, no secrets, no questions about propriety. Agreed? Agreed, Seraphine managed, though her hand still tingled where his lips had touched. They walked back to town slowly, reluctant to end their time together. At the hotel, Reed handed her down from the boardwalk with unnecessary care, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than strictly required. May I call on you again? Tomorrow, perhaps? I'd like that very much. Good, I'll pick you up at 2. Maybe we could ride out to the ranch, in the wagon, since you mentioned you can't ride yet. I'd like you to see it. See if you can imagine yourself there. The suggestion made Seraphine's heart race. I'd be honored. That night, lying in her hotel bed, Seraphine found herself smiling at the ceiling like a fool. Tomorrow she would see Reed's ranch, the land he'd built with his own hands, the home he'd created from nothing. Tomorrow she would take another step toward a future she'd stopped believing was possible. But first, she had a decision to make. The next morning, Seraphine went to the telegraph office and composed a message to Eleanor in Atlanta. A letter would take too long, and this news couldn't wait. She counted out precious coins to pay for the transmission, then watched as the operator tapped out her words across the miles. Eleanor. Safe. Found work teaching. Man from advertisement courting me properly now. No more lies. Real chance at real future. We'll write details soon. Thank you for everything. Seraphine. The reply came 3 hours later, delivered to the hotel by the telegraph operator himself, who couldn't quite hide his curiosity about the lady sending and receiving expensive telegrams. Seraphine. Thank God. So proud of you. Take the chance. Be brave. Be honest. Be happy. You deserve it. Eleanor. Seraphine folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her Bible, a reminder that someone had believed in her enough to sacrifice their own chance at a new life. She would make it count. She would make it all count. At 2 o'clock, Reed arrived with a wagon that had clearly been cleaned for the occasion. He'd also brought a thick blanket, anticipating the rough roads, and offered his hand to help her up with such careful courtesy that Seraphine found herself fighting tears. The ride to the Broken Creek Ranch took 45 minutes, winding through country that grew progressively more beautiful and more wild. Reed pointed out landmarks, the creek that gave his ranch its name, the ridge where cattle sometimes gathered, the line of cottonwoods that marked his property boundary. He talked about plans for the future, about wanting to build a proper barn, about maybe adding chickens if his wife wanted fresh eggs. "If your wife wants," Seraphine repeated, catching the hypothetical. Reed glanced at her, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Well, I'm courting someone who might have opinions about chickens. Seems wise to consider her preferences." "I have no opinions about chickens," Seraphine admitted. "I've never even touched a chicken." "We'll remedy that if you stick around." The ranch, when it came into view, took Seraphine's breath away. The house was solid timber, 2 stories with a wide porch and real glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. It sat in a natural clearing, protected from the worst weather by a rise of land behind it, but open to views of the creek and mountains beyond. A barn stood nearby, well built if aging, and fenced pastures stretched in organized patterns. Cattle grazed peacefully, their red and white hides bright against the prairie grass. "Oh," Seraphine breathed. "Reed, it's beautiful." He looked pleased and embarrassed in equal measure. "It's rough still, needs work, improvements, but it's home." He helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the house, pointing out various features: the root cellar he had dug himself, the vegetable garden plot that had been his mother's and now sat fallow, the hen house that stood empty waiting for those hypothetical chickens. His pride in what he'd built was evident in every word, every gesture. Inside, the house was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed careful craftsmanship, if not elegance. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A table sat near the windows, positioned to catch the light. Doors led to what Seraphine assumed were bedrooms, and a staircase climbed to the second floor. "It's meant for a family," Reed said, watching her take it all in. "I built it that way on purpose. Probably foolish optimism, but I wanted space for children someday, for a life that was more than just me and my work." Seraphine moved through the space, touching things carefully: the mantel over the fireplace, the sturdy table, the kitchen implements hanging with military precision. She could imagine it, she realized with a start. Could imagine herself here, cooking at that stove, sitting at that table, watching the sunset through those windows while Reed worked on ranch accounts. Could imagine children running through these rooms, their laughter filling the emptiness. "The kitchen needs work," Reed was saying, nervous now in the face of her silence. "Stove's temperamental, and the counter space is limited, but it functions. And upstairs there are 3 bedrooms, 1 large, 2 smaller. I sleep in the large one, but obviously if we were to—" He trailed off, flustered. "If we were to marry," Seraphine finished gently, "I imagine we'd share the large bedroom, and the smaller ones could be for children." "Yes, that." Reed's ears had gone red. "I know it's premature to discuss such things, but I wanted you to see it all, understand what you'd be considering if this courtship progresses." Seraphine turned to face him fully. "Reed, you've been very clear about what your life entails. You've been honest about the challenges, the hard work, the isolation. You've shown me your world without pretense. That means more than you probably realize. And? What do you think?" She looked around the room again, really seeing it this time, not as a stranger evaluating a property, but as someone imagining a life. "I think it would be hard. I think I'd fail at things and frustrate both of us. I think there would be days when I missed things about my old life or got lonely or wondered if I was cut out for this." She paused, meeting his eyes. "But I also think I could be happy here. I think I could learn to thrive here. And I think with you, it might be worth all the difficulty." Reed's face did something complicated, relief and joy, and something deeper that made Seraphine's breath catch. "Can I show you something?" he asked. He led her to the empty garden plot, now overgrown with weeds. "My mother planted this garden every spring for 25 years. She grew vegetables that kept us fed through the winters, herbs for cooking and medicine, flowers just for the beauty of them. When she passed, I couldn't bring myself to plant it. Seemed wrong, somehow, without her here to tend it. But I've been thinking, if you stayed, if you wanted, maybe you could make it yours. Plant what you want, learn what grows well here. Not to replace my mother's garden, but to start fresh with something that's yours." The gesture, so simple and so profound, nearly undid Seraphine completely. "I'd like that," she managed, her voice thick. "I'd like that very much." They spent another hour at the ranch, Reed showing her the barn and introducing her to his favorite horse, a mare named Molly, who was patient with Seraphine's inexperienced attempts at petting. They walked the property line within sight of the house, and Reed pointed out where he hoped to expand, where he'd lost cattle to wolves last winter, where the first wildflowers bloomed in spring. On the ride back to town, Seraphine found herself leaning slightly into Reed's solid presence, bone-weary from emotion and possibility. He didn't seem to mind, occasionally glancing down at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Seraphine," he said as they approached Silver Falls, "I need to tell you something." The serious tone made her sit up straighter. "All right. There's talk in town. About us. About this courtship. Most of it's supportive. People like what you've done these past weeks, how you've worked hard and helped others. But there are some who think I'm a fool for giving you a second chance, who think you'll reveal yourself as the fraud they originally believed you were and break my heart." "Do you believe that?" Seraphine asked, her throat tight. "No. But I need you to know that courting me means dealing with that talk, with the skepticism, with people watching to see if you fail. If that's too much, if you'd rather avoid the scrutiny, I'd understand." Seraphine was quiet for a moment, watching the town grow closer. Then she said, "I've spent my entire life caring what people thought of me, worrying about reputation and appearances and social standing. It destroyed me when I lost it all because I didn't know who I was without that external validation. But these past weeks I've learned something. The people whose opinions actually matter are the ones who see your actions, not your circumstances. Sarah Blackwood saw me work hard and gave me respect. Grace Thompson saw me help in crisis and gave me gratitude. Those children see me try and fail and try again, and they give me their trust. And you see everything, the lies and the truth, the failure and the effort, and you're still here offering me a chance. Those are the opinions that matter. The rest is just noise." Reed pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the hotel, but made no move to help her down yet. Instead, he turned to her fully, his expression intense. "You're a remarkable woman, Seraphine Locke. I hope you're starting to see that." "I'm starting to," she admitted. "Thanks in large part to you." This time, when he kissed her hand in parting, his lips lingered, and Seraphine felt the touch all the way to her bones. She floated into the hotel in a daze, barely registering Martha Watson's knowing smile. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that felt like courting in its truest form. Reed came to town 3 times a week, always at the same time, always properly announced. They took walks, sat on the hotel porch talking for hours, attended church together on Sundays. He was teaching her to ride, patient with her fear, encouraging with her small victories. She was teaching him about books and music and the joy of a well-told story, reading to him in the evenings while he whittled or worked on leather repairs. The town watched, of course, but gradually the skepticism faded, replaced by something like approval. When Seraphine walked through Silver Falls now, women greeted her by name. Children ran up to show her treasures or ask questions. Even Mrs. Henderson had softened, going so far as to invite Seraphine to the church quilting circle. "You've earned your place here," Sarah told her one afternoon, watching her interact easily with the townspeople. "That's no small thing." But as the weeks passed and their courtship deepened, a shadow loomed that neither Reed nor Seraphine wanted to acknowledge: the question of what came next. They couldn't court forever. At some point, a decision had to be made. It was Reed who finally broached the subject, 6 weeks into their courtship, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose. "Seraphine," he said quietly, "I think it's time we talked about the future. Our future, if you're willing." Her heart began to hammer. "I'm willing." "I'm in love with you," he said simply, turning to face her fully. "Somewhere between watching you teach children and rescue lost souls and learn to bake bread that doesn't qualify as a weapon, I fell completely in love with you. Not who I thought you were, not who you're trying to become, but exactly who you are right now, brave and honest and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with appearances. Tears spilled down Seraphine's cheeks. I love you too. I think I started falling the moment you showed me kindness, even as you sent me away, and I haven't stopped since. Then marry me, Reed said, his voice rough with emotion. Not because it's convenient or expected, not because of any arrangement or obligation. Marry me because you want to build a life here, with me, in this beautiful, difficult place. Marry me because you love me, and I love you, and that's enough to build on. Yes, Seraphine breathed. Yes, absolutely yes. Reed pulled her into his arms then, and for the first time he kissed her properly. Not her hand in courtly gesture, but her lips with all the pent-up longing and tenderness of their careful courtship. Seraphine kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears and feeling the solid strength of him anchoring her to this new life, this new future. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this right. I'll speak to Minister Blackwood, ask his permission properly. We'll announce our engagement at church, let everyone know this is real and honest. And then we'll plan a wedding that's about us, about our commitment, not about meeting anyone's expectations. How long? Seraphine asked, already aching at the thought of separation. A month? That gives us time to prepare, for you to make a dress if you want, for me to make some improvements to the house. And it's long enough to be respectable, but short enough that I don't lose my mind waiting. Seraphine laughed, the sound coming out watery but genuine. A month sounds perfect. That Sunday, Reed stood up in church and formally announced their engagement, his voice steady and proud. The congregation erupted in applause, and afterward people swarmed them with congratulations and well wishes. Even the doubters seemed convinced now, won over by the evidence of genuine affection between them. The month that followed was a whirlwind. Sarah and the church women helped Seraphine create a wedding dress from fabric Reed insisted on paying for. Simple cream cotton, elegant in its plainness, practical enough that she could wear it again for special occasions. The town rallied to prepare for the wedding, treating it as a community celebration. Grace Thompson offered to make the cake. Mrs. Henderson donated flowers from her carefully tended garden. The minister's wife organized a quilting party to create a wedding quilt. Seraphine found herself swept up in genuine community for the first time in her life. Not the artificial social obligations of Atlanta society, but real connection with people who'd seen her at her worst and still chose to celebrate with her. The night before her wedding, alone in her hotel room for the last time, Seraphine thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train nearly 3 months ago. That woman felt like a stranger now, desperate, dishonest, fragile in ways that had nothing to do with real strength. She'd been broken by circumstances beyond her control and made terrible choices out of fear and pride. But that woman had also been brave enough to try, brave enough to keep going when everything fell apart, brave enough to learn and change and become someone new. Tomorrow Seraphine would marry Reed Callahan in a simple ceremony surrounded by people who'd become her community. She would promise to love and honor and build a life with a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. She would become a rancher's wife, with all the challenges and joys that entailed. She would become, finally and fully, who she was always meant to be. Not a society ornament or a desperate fraud, but a woman forged in the fires of failure and grace, strong enough for this hard, beautiful life, brave enough to embrace love when it finally found her. The woman God intended, she thought, remembering the words she'd imagined speaking someday. Not perfect, not without scars and struggles, but real and honest and whole at last. And tomorrow, standing before God and community and the man she loved, she would step into that future with clear eyes and a full heart, ready for whatever came next. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect September day that seemed designed by Providence itself. Seraphine woke in her hotel room to find Sarah Blackwood already there, along with Grace Thompson and several other women from the church, all wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. "We're not letting you get ready alone," Sarah announced, setting down a basket filled with mysterious supplies. "Every bride needs help on her wedding day, and you've become one of ours." The words made Seraphine's throat tight with emotion. One of ours. 3 months ago, she'd been a stranger, an interloper, someone to be pitied or scorned. Now she was theirs, claimed by this community through the simple act of showing up and trying. Grace approached with baby Caroline bundled in her arms. I wanted you to see her before the ceremony. She's thriving thanks to you. Seraphine touched the baby's soft cheek, marveling at how much she'd grown in just weeks. Thanks to Dr. Morrison and your own strength. I just helped. You did more than help, and we both know it. Grace's eyes were serious. You gave me my daughter. That's a debt I can never repay, but I can stand beside you today as friend and witness. Let me do that. The morning passed in a blur of activity. The women helped Seraphine into her wedding dress, the simple cream cotton that somehow felt more precious than any of the silk gowns she'd worn in her old life. They arranged her hair, weaving in wildflowers from the prairie, the same kind of flowers Reed had brought to the depot that first day, though Seraphine doubted anyone else remembered that detail. She'd remembered, had asked specifically for them as a private acknowledgement of how far they'd both come. Martha Watson appeared with the one piece of jewelry Seraphine had left from her mother, a delicate gold locket containing a tiny portrait. For something old, she said, fastening it around Seraphine's neck. Sarah produced a lace handkerchief. This was my mother's. For something borrowed. Grace offered a blue ribbon to weave into her hair. For something blue. And the dress is new, Mrs. Henderson said, surprising everyone with her appearance. She held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. This is for you, for after. Inside was a beautiful embroidered apron, the kind meant for everyday work, but stitched with such care it was clearly a labor of love. I made it thinking of my own daughter, Mrs. Henderson said gruffly, but she doesn't need it where she is in Philadelphia. You do, for your new life. Seraphine hugged her impulsively, not caring that tears threatened her carefully composed face. Thank you for this and for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. You earned it, Mrs. Henderson replied, but her eyes were suspiciously bright. Now let's get you to that church before Reed thinks you've changed your mind. The walk to the church was short but felt momentous. Seraphine could see townspeople gathering, dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Saturday. Children ran ahead, giggling with excitement. Someone had strung wildflowers along the church fence, and the doors stood open in welcome. At the entrance, Minister Blackwood waited to escort her down the aisle. His smile was warm as he offered his arm. Ready? More ready than I've ever been for anything, Seraphine said truthfully. Good, because there's a man at the front of this church who's been pacing for the last hour, and I think if we make him wait any longer, he might wear a hole in the floor. They entered the church, and Seraphine's breath caught. Every pew was full. The townspeople who'd witnessed her arrival in disgrace were here now to witness her redemption. But more than that, they were here in genuine celebration, faces bright with goodwill and curiosity and the human love of weddings. And at the front, beside the altar decorated with more prairie wildflowers, stood Reed. He wore a new suit, dark and well-fitted, clearly purchased specially for this day. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved, but it was his expression that made Seraphine's heart stutter. He looked at her like she was everything, not beautiful in the abstract way she'd been admired in Atlanta ballrooms, but beautiful in a way that mattered, a way that saw through to her soul. The walk down the aisle seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Seraphine was aware of people watching, of whispers and smiles, but her focus narrowed to Reed, to the man who'd sent her away and then given her a second chance, who'd seen her fail and struggle and slowly become someone new and loved her through all of it. When she reached him, Reed took her hands in his, and Seraphine felt the calluses on his palms match the new ones on hers. They were both marked by honest work now, both transformed by the choices that had brought them to this moment. Minister Blackwood began the ceremony, his voice rich with warmth and authority. The traditional words washed over them, for better or worse, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. Seraphine had heard these vows at countless society weddings, but they'd always seemed like pretty phrases, obligations wrapped in ceremony. Now, standing before Reed with her community surrounding them, the words felt like promises she genuinely wanted to make, commitments she was ready to honor. When it came time for their personal vows, Reed went first. His voice was steady but emotional. Seraphine, when I placed that advertisement, I thought I knew exactly what I needed. I was wrong. I needed someone who would challenge me and surprise me and make me see the world differently. I needed someone brave enough to fail and honest enough to admit it and strong enough to keep trying. I needed you, though I didn't know it until you stepped off that train and shattered all my expectations. I promise to love you as you are, to support you as you grow, to build a life with you that's honest and real and full of the kind of joy that comes from genuine partnership. You're not the bride I ordered, but you're the wife I need and the woman I love with all my heart. Seraphine's tears were falling freely now, but she didn't care. When her turn came, she found her voice despite the emotion. Reed, I came to Montana built on lies and desperation. You would have been justified in sending me away and never looking back. Instead, you showed me kindness and gave me the chance to become someone worth knowing. You've seen me at my worst, vain and helpless and dishonest, and at my struggling best, and you've loved me through all of it. I promise to be your true partner, to work beside you in building our life together. I promise to keep learning and growing and becoming the kind of woman who can thrive here. I promise to love you honestly, completely, and forever. You gave me more than a second chance. You gave me a reason to become who I was always meant to be. Reed was openly crying now too, and Seraphine heard sniffles throughout the congregation. Minister Blackwood had to clear his throat twice before he could continue with the ring exchange. The rings were simple gold bands, nothing like the elaborate jewelry Seraphine had once worn, but when Reed slid the ring onto her finger, it felt like the most precious thing she'd ever owned. When she returned the gesture, placing a matching band on his work-roughened hand, she thought about all the ways they would grow together, through seasons and struggles, through joys and sorrows, through the daily work of building a life. By the power vested in me, Minister Blackwood said, his voice thick with emotion, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reed, you may kiss your bride. Reed pulled Seraphine close, and the kiss they shared was both sweet and promising, a hello and a vow all at once. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and when they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, they turned to face their community as Mr. and Mrs. Callahan. The celebration afterward was held in the churchyard with pounds laden with food that various families had contributed. Someone had brought a fiddle, and impromptu dancing broke out on the grass. Children ran wild with the freedom of a festival. Grace Thompson's cake was proclaimed a masterpiece. Mrs. Henderson's garden flowers adorned every table. Seraphine found herself swept from person to person, receiving congratulations and advice, and more than a few tears from women who'd come to care for her. Tommy Morrison informed her solemnly that she was still expected at school on Monday, bride or not, which made everyone laugh. Little Mary presented her with a carefully drawn picture of the wedding that Seraphine promised to treasure forever. Dr. Morrison cornered her during a quiet moment. Mrs. Callahan, he said, testing out her new name, I want you to know my offer stands. If you're interested in studying medicine, I'd be happy to teach you what I know. There's need for women healers out here, and you've got the aptitude. I'll think about it, Seraphine said, touched by his continued faith. Right now, I need to learn to be a rancher's wife, but perhaps someday, when I'm more settled, I could apprentice with you. The offer remains open, he said with a nod. As afternoon faded toward evening, Reed found Seraphine near the refreshment table and pulled her aside. Ready to go home, Mrs. Callahan? Home. The word sent a thrill through her. Not the hotel room she'd occupied for 3 months, but the ranch. Their ranch now, their home. More than ready. Their departure was marked by cheers and thrown wildflowers, with well wishes following them as Reed helped Seraphine into the wagon. Someone had decorated it with ribbons and more flowers, and tin cans tied to the back rattled cheerfully as they set off. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the enormity of what had just happened. Reed held the reins with one hand, his other arm around Seraphine, pulling her close against his side. She leaned into him, watching the familiar landscape pass by with new eyes. This was her land now, her territory, her home. When they arrived, Reed stopped the wagon but made no immediate move to get down. I want to do something, he said. A tradition my father started with my mother. He climbed down and came around to Seraphine's side, but instead of helping her down normally, he swept her into his arms, carrying her toward the house. Seraphine laughed, clinging to his neck. Reed, what are you doing? Carrying my bride across the threshold, he said, kicking open the door. My father carried my mother into their first home this way, said it was about starting fresh, about the man promising to bear his wife's burdens. I want that for us. Inside, Seraphine could see that someone, probably his ranch hands, had been busy. Wildflowers filled every available jar and container. The fireplace was laid ready to light. The table was set with simple dishes and a covered basket that probably contained food from the wedding feast. Reed set her down gently but kept his arms around her. Welcome home, Seraphine Callahan. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the rough stubble already showing despite his morning shave. I'm home, she said wonderingly. I'm really home. That first night as husband and wife was tender and awkward and beautiful, two people learning each other with patience and gentle humor. They fumbled and laughed and eventually found their way to something that felt right, that felt like the beginning of a lifetime of intimacy. Afterward, lying in Reed's arms in the darkness, Seraphine thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train. She felt a wave of compassion for that desperate, scared person who'd thought lies were her only option. That woman had been so broken, so lost, so convinced she had nothing of value to offer. What are you thinking? Reed asked, his voice rumbling against her ear where she lay on his chest. About how far I've come. About the woman I was, and the woman I'm becoming. And what conclusion have you reached? Seraphine smiled in the darkness. That sometimes God's greatest mercies look like our worst disasters. If you'd married the woman you thought you were getting, if Eleanor had actually come, you would have gotten a decent partner, probably. Someone capable and kind. But you wouldn't have gotten me, and I wouldn't have been forced to become someone I could actually respect. I'm grateful for you, Reed said simply. Every difficult, beautiful, surprising part of you. The months that followed their wedding were the hardest and happiest of Seraphine's life. Winter came early and harsh, just as Reed had warned. The temperatures dropped so brutally that water froze in seconds, and going outside felt like being stabbed by 1,000 icy knives. Seraphine learned to dress in layers, to move quickly between house and barn, to break ice in water troughs and check on cattle in conditions that terrified her. She failed constantly. Bread burned or came out dense. Laundry froze on the line before it could dry. She fell in the snow more times than she could count, once spraining her wrist badly enough that Dr. Morrison had to wrap it. The isolation sometimes pressed down on her like a physical weight, days passing without seeing another human face besides Reed's. But she also learned. Her hands grew stronger, more capable. She mastered the temperamental stove, learned to judge bread by touch and sound, developed a system for household management that worked for their life. She started that garden in early spring, working the soil under Sarah's guidance, planting vegetables and herbs, and yes, flowers for beauty's sake, because her mother had been right. Beauty mattered even in hard places. Reed taught her to ride properly, and Seraphine discovered she loved it, the freedom of moving across open land, the partnership with her horse Molly, the way the Montana sky seemed endless from horseback. She learned to help with cattle when extra hands were needed, to assist with branding and counting and the 100 tasks that ranch life demanded. In the evenings, they read together by lamplight. Seraphine had brought her few remaining books from the hotel, and Reed had a surprising collection of his own. They took turns reading aloud, sharing stories and ideas, and slowly building an intellectual life alongside their physical one. She continued teaching at the church school 2 days a week, riding into town with Reed when he went for supplies. The children had been delighted by her marriage, and watching their faces light up when she arrived became one of Seraphine's greatest joys. She also began apprenticing with Dr. Morrison, learning practical medicine that went far beyond her textbook knowledge. By spring, Seraphine discovered she was pregnant. The news came as both joy and terror. She knew enough about childbirth to understand the risks, especially for a first baby. But Reed's delight was so pure, so complete, that her fear couldn't quite extinguish her happiness. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "I don't know the first thing about babies," Seraphine protested. "You'll learn, same way you've learned everything else, by trying and failing and trying again until you get it right." Their daughter was born on a cold November night, delivered by Dr. Morrison with Grace Thompson assisting. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Seraphine understood viscerally what Grace had endured. But when they placed her baby in her arms, a screaming, perfect creature with Reed's brown eyes and her auburn hair, Seraphine felt something shift in her soul. "Her name?" Reed asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Eleanor," Seraphine said without hesitation, "for the woman who gave me a second chance at life." They sent a telegram to Atlanta, and Eleanor's reply came within days, filled with joy and blessings, and the news that she'd found a good position and was doing well. The knowledge that her friend was thriving made Seraphine's happiness complete. The years passed, marked by seasons and growth and the slow accumulation of a life well lived. A son came 2 years after Eleanor. They named him James for Minister Blackwood, who'd become like a father to them both. Another daughter arrived 3 years later, strong-willed and wild, whom they called Grace. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Seraphine's garden became famous throughout the county for its productivity and beauty. She became known as a skilled midwife and healer, working alongside Dr. Morrison until his death, and then continuing his work. Women came from miles around when their time came, trusting Seraphine's steady hands and medical knowledge. The children grew healthy and strong, educated by their mother in reading and numbers, trained by their father in ranch work and practical skills. Eleanor proved to have a gift for horses. James was quiet and thoughtful, always with his nose in a book. Young Grace was fearless, already declaring at age 4 that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up. Silver Falls grew too, from a rough frontier town into a proper community with a school and a bank and even a small hospital. Seraphine served on the hospital board, pushing for better care for women and children, using her education and status as Mrs. Callahan to effect real change. Through it all, Reed remained her anchor and her partner. They fought sometimes, about money, about decisions, about the normal friction of two strong-willed people building a life together. But they never stopped talking, never stopped trying to understand each other, never lost sight of the love that had bloomed from such unlikely beginnings. 20 years after that September wedding, Seraphine stood in her kitchen preparing bread for the community dinner at church. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the dough responding to her touch as naturally as breathing. Through the window, she could see Reed working with James in the near pasture, teaching their son the finer points of cattle management. Eleanor was at the barn practicing with her horses. Grace was somewhere causing trouble, as usual. A knock at the door pulled Seraphine from her thoughts. She wiped her floury hands on her apron, not the embroidered one Mrs. Henderson had given her, though she still had that treasured gift carefully stored, but a practical, everyday one she'd sewn herself, and went to answer. A young woman stood on the porch, and Seraphine's heart clenched with recognition. She was perhaps 22, wearing clothes that had once been fine, but were now worn and mended. Her eyes held the same desperate fear Seraphine remembered from her own face 20 years ago. Behind her, a wagon waited with a man who could only be her husband, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "Mrs. Callahan?" the woman said, her refined Eastern accent marking her as clearly as a brand. "I'm Margaret Hartford. My husband John and I are homesteaders. We arrived last month. I heard you sometimes help new wives adjust to frontier life. I wondered if you might—" She trailed off, looking ashamed. Seraphine's heart broke and sang simultaneously. She saw herself in this young woman's eyes, saw the fear and pride and desperate hope. "Come in," she said warmly. "Both of you. There's coffee on and bread about to come out of the oven. Let's talk." As Margaret Hartford tentatively entered, followed by her nervous husband, Seraphine caught sight of Reed watching from the pasture. He'd seen the visitors and was probably wondering if she needed help. She waved to signal everything was fine, and even at this distance, she could see his nod of understanding. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the same sturdy table where Seraphine had eaten thousands of meals, where her children had done their lessons, where she and Reed had worked through problems and shared joys. Seraphine poured coffee and settled across from her visitor, seeing 2 decades fall away. "Tell me," she said gently, "what brought you west?" Margaret's story tumbled out. A family business failure, a hasty marriage to escape debt, arriving with no skills and fewer prospects. Different details, but the same desperate song Seraphine knew by heart. When Margaret finished, close to tears, Seraphine reached across and took her hand. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. The woman you are right now, scared and unprepared and feeling like a failure, she's not who you'll be a year from now. You're going to struggle. You're going to fail at things you thought should be simple. You're going to have days when you wonder if you made a terrible mistake coming here. Margaret's face crumpled, but Seraphine held firm, her grip steady. But you're also going to discover strength you didn't know you had. You're going to learn skills that make you genuinely useful. You're going to become part of a community that values what you do, not where you came from. And if you're very lucky and very brave, you're going to look back on the woman you are today and feel grateful for her courage in taking the first step, even if that step was terrifying. How do you know? Margaret whispered. Seraphine smiled, the expression holding 2 decades of hard-won wisdom. Because 20 years ago, I arrived in Silver Falls as a mail-order bride built entirely on lies. I was sent away the day I arrived, and I deserved it. Everything I thought I was had been stripped away, and I had no idea who I was without it. She paused, letting the words sink in. But I learned, slowly, painfully, one failure and small success at a time. And I discovered that the woman I became, forged by this hard, beautiful life, was so much better than the woman I'd been trying to be. Margaret stared at her, clearly struggling to reconcile this confident, capable rancher's wife with the story of desperate beginnings. I arrived here a lie, Seraphine continued, the words feeling like both confession and benediction. But I became the woman God intended, not perfect, not without struggles or doubts or bad days, but real and honest and strong enough for this life. You can too, if you're willing to do the work. John Hartford, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Ma'am, that's a powerful testimony. Would you be willing to help Margaret learn, the way someone must have helped you? Seraphine thought of Sarah Blackwood, of Grace Thompson, of Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Henderson, and all the people who'd given her chances she hadn't deserved. I'd be honored, she said. Margaret, come by twice a week. I'll teach you everything I know about frontier housekeeping, gardening, basic medicine, and surviving the winter. It won't be easy, but if you're willing to work, I promise you'll get through this. After the Hartfords left, promising to return the following Tuesday, Reed came in from the pasture. He found Seraphine still sitting at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the worn wood, tears streaming down her face. Darling? He was beside her immediately, concern etched in his features. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Seraphine said, laughing through her tears. Everything's right. That woman, Margaret, she's me 20 years ago. Scared and lost and trying to be something she's not. And I get to help her, Reed. I get to give her what Sarah and the others gave me. Reed pulled her into his arms, and Seraphine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You've come so far, he murmured into her hair. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. The woman we've become together, Seraphine corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you, without your willingness to look past my lies and see who I could be. Best surprise of my life, Reed said, echoing the words he'd spoken so many times over the years. I ordered a simple bride, but God sent me you, wild and complicated and perfect for me in every way that matters. That evening, after supper with their boisterous family, after Eleanor and James had been sent to do homework and young Grace had finally been wrestled into bed, Reed and Seraphine sat on their porch watching the sun set over land they'd built together. The same porch where he'd proposed, where they'd weathered storms and celebrated victories, where they'd built a life one day at a time. Do you ever regret it? Reed asked quietly. Giving up the possibility of returning east, of finding an easier life? Seraphine didn't answer immediately, really considering the question. She thought about Atlanta, about the society life she'd once thought essential. She thought about the woman she'd been, beautiful and polished and utterly hollow. She thought about the hard years, the failures, the moments of doubt and fear. Never, she said finally, not once. This life has tested me and broken me and rebuilt me into someone I can respect. I've helped bring children into the world and taught them to read. I've saved lives and lost some despite my best efforts. I've learned to bake bread and birth babies and survive Montana winters. I've raised 3 children who are strong and kind and capable. I've loved you through easy times and hard, and been loved in return in a way I never dreamed possible." She turned to look at him, this man who'd given her everything by first taking everything away. "I have no regrets, Reed. Not a single one." "Good," Reed said, pulling her close. "Because I don't either. You're still the best surprise that ever stepped off a train." As darkness settled over the Montana prairie and stars began to appear in the vast sky, Seraphine Callahan, née Locke, formerly of New Orleans and Atlanta, now and forever of the Broken Creek Ranch, felt a peace so profound it was almost tangible. She'd arrived here built on lies, running from debts and disgrace, wearing silk and carrying secrets. She'd been rejected, humbled, forced to start over with nothing but determination and the slim hope of redemption. But she'd survived. She'd learned. She'd grown into someone capable and strong, someone who contributed real value to her community, someone who'd earned respect through honest effort rather than inherited it through family name. She'd arrived a fraud, but became something true. Arrived helpless, but became someone others turned to for help. Arrived alone, but built a family and a life so rich and full it sometimes took her breath away. 20 years ago, a cowboy had ordered a simple bride, and the wild, desperate woman who stepped off that train had left him breathless for all the wrong reasons. But through grace and second chances, through failure and effort, through love that saw past lies to the truth underneath, they'd built something neither had expected. Something real, something lasting, something worth every difficult step of the journey. As Seraphine drifted off to sleep that night, wrapped in her husband's arms in the home they'd built together, her last thought was gratitude, for the courage to try, for the community that caught her when she fell, for the man who'd seen her at her worst and loved her to her best, and for the unexpected grace that had transformed a beautiful disaster into the most honest and fulfilling life she could have imagined. She'd come west as the wrong bride, but she'd become exactly the right wife, the right mother, the right woman for this hard, beautiful life. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was more than enough. It was everything.